common standard called ERC 721. So when we started, we were really just a marketplace for CryptoKitties because there were no other assets that existed on the blockchain. So it was kind of a pretty simple product and not a lot to do except another place to sell your CryptoKitties. But we added sort of more advanced capabilities on top of what the CryptoKitties marketplace provided. So we allowed people to sell these things for a fixed price, sell them in an auction, bundle them together. And so what happened was, as more and more assets came online, in addition to CryptoKitties, we were able to support a diverse set of these non-fungible tokens that represent everything from an item inside of a game to a piece of digital art to a event ticket, or even to a domain name. And there's now over 12 million different non-fungible tokens on Ethereum at the moment, roughly, and hundreds of different types of non-fungible tokens. Again, everything, from games to digital art. So why are these crypto assets, these non-fungible tokens, interesting? Well, one way to kind of think about them is that they're sort of a combination of a digital and physical asset. So with typical digital assets, for example, an item inside of a game, or you could even think of like a Twitter handle as a sort of digital asset. These things are not really, they don't have the same sort of scarcity that you have with physical things. They can kind of disappear at any moment. There's no reliability of them sticking around. And as a result, if you have an item inside of a game, it's often difficult to actually go and take that outside of the game and trade it for real money or real cryptocurrency. Whereas physical assets, on the other hand, they're obviously a lot more costly to produce, right? You have to actually create something physical. So while you can have scarce physical assets, that comes at a cost. They're difficult to track, and you can still counterfeit these physical assets. Crypto assets, on the other hand, sort of combine the best of both properties. So they're provably scarce, they last a long time, they're easy to trade, they're impossible to counterfeit. And so ultimately, we think that these crypto assets will become more and more valuable to users, even though we're still obviously in the very early stages of adoption and use cases. So what does OpenSea provide? Well, we not only provide a general marketplace for buying and selling these assets, but we also provide developers with a way to build their own marketplace on top of our technology. So you can sort of easily set up a shop for your NFTs, go and sell them. You can capture revenue when your items sell on the secondary market. You can get stats and insights on how things are selling, and you can sell in stable coins like DAI, or even another ERC20 token that acts as kind of like an in-game currency. So as the next section, I'll just talk a little bit about what are people actually using NFTs for today. So one of the first interesting things that people thought of right after CryptoKitty launched was this idea that you could have games that kind of interoperate with each other. So games that like you can kind of move assets from one game into another game, or you could have assets combine even though they're from different games. And so one of the first projects to try that out was this project called Gods Unchained, which is a trading card game. And the way this worked was you actually could bring your CryptoKitty inside of the Gods Unchained world and use it as like a statue on your cardboard. So when you're playing the trading card game, you'd have this like CryptoKitty from the CryptoKitties game inside of it. And so here you can see some of those collectibles being traded alongside other Gods Unchained collectibles. Another cool sort of, this is actually kind of outside of the gaming space, but it's still an example of interoperability, is this idea of having digital art museums inside of virtual worlds. So this is a project called Decentraland, and this is actually an art museum that Opensea built in partnership with Decentraland, where you can go in and you can admire people's digital art inside of this museum. And this type of thing is really only possible when you have these open standards where any artist can mint an NFT and start displaying their art inside of the museum. And it all just sort of happens almost magically because all of these NFTs conform to the same standard. And so you can just kind of like bring them into the world really easily. Here's a similar example of a project called Crypto Voxels. And here, this is a similar virtual world. It's a little more, I guess, rough around the edges and a little more grassroots. But here, people have created art installations. They've created virtual events. In fact, even the avatars in this particular screenshot are all wearing these NFTs that are like wearable NFTs inside of the world. So there's definitely a lot of activity going on in kind of the open world, open economy space. And the cool thing about Crypto Voxels is Crypto Voxels has been around, I think, since early 2018, and they've done their entire, they've managed their entire economy through Opensea. So the founder distributed his initial land through Opensea sales at around like 0.2 or 0.3 ETH. And over time, over the last couple of years, the price of land has risen over time as the world has gotten bigger, as more and more people have known about it. And now I think an average price of a piece of land is around like 1 or 2 ETH. And we've had a couple sales of bundles of land for over $150,000 on Opensea. So this is actually becoming like a pretty substantial economy. Obviously still a really small one, but an economy where people are like investing in this real estate, building things out, and really like owning it in sort of a community way. We've also seen some experiments, pretty early experiments with tokenizing physical assets as NFTs. So here are diamonds, real physical diamonds that are tokenized as NFTs. So the idea is you can trade around the digital version of it and then redeem it for the physical asset. We've also had wine tokenized as NFTs, similar idea where you could imagine trading the asset many different times before it's actually redeemed for the physical thing, and having a much more efficient market for these types of things than you would have if you have to trade it around physically every time that you're buying and selling. And then we've also had this idea of physical and digital twins. So this was a project by the Austrian Postal Service where they created real stamps that could be used to send letters to people. But when you bought one of these stamps, you also got a crypto stamp. So the product was called Crypto Stamp. And these crypto stamps were actually like separated from their physical counterparty. And you could go ahead and trade these digital things on a marketplace like Opensea, independent of the physical asset. So that was kind of this interesting experiment where they tethered the value of it to a physical item, but then the digital item actually kind of took on a new life. And then what I'm really excited about is NFTs that are just, increasingly more and more useful in, for real world use cases. So for example, I believe you guys have your own ENS name, and ENS names are also NFTs that can be bought and sold. And there's actually like a small but growing market where you can buy and sell these things. And it's, it's just a useful asset that, gives your address a human readable name, much like a domain name for the regular web. And there's now several projects that are creating sort of similar types of domain names that have different use cases. This is another project called, that is actually a project created by a website called pools.fyi, which is sort of a DeFi website that shows a list of different liquidity pools like Uniswap and things like that. But what they did here was they created advertisements that are sold, and when you buy an advertisement, you get to advertise something on their site. So they're actually using NFTs to just sell advertising space. Here's an example from a long time ago, which is selling a course, so a subscription to a course as an NFT. And then this is the screenshot. You can see that this ad space is represented as a NFT. DeFi, or over the last month or so, we've really seen an explosion of movement from the decentralized finance space into NFTs. So examples of this, there's a wide range of different examples where DeFis and NFTs start intersecting, but one example is this project called Wrapped CryptoKitties. And the idea with Wrapped CryptoKitties was it was a way to turn your unique CryptoKitty into a fungible token. So you could take a CryptoKitty, deposit it in a smart contract and get a coin back, or deposit one of the coins and get a CryptoKitty back. And what that created was this token that represented a pool of CryptoKitties that could then be traded on Uniswap, or it could be used as a currency. So here you can see that someone has listed their CryptoKitty in this denomination of wrapped CryptoKitties. So this person is selling this CryptoKitty for 10 wrapped CryptoKitties. And then most recently, we saw this project called Meme, which has a mechanic where you can farm different non-fungible tokens, different collectibles. And so each of these assets that are created by the Meme team, or actually created from the Meme contract, have been farmed by staking a certain amount of ETH for a certain period of time. That was sort of a really interesting mechanic to introduce, because it was almost like you had to do a certain amount of work in order to earn an NFT, and then obviously you could go and sell that NFT on an open market. And then I think one of the last sections is one really interesting thing that has happened was after CryptoKitties launched, there were a number of projects that kind of were fast follows to CryptoKitties, and some of them, didn't end up taking off, and the team sort of decided that they were done with the project. But what was interesting was the assets were still around, right? Because as I mentioned, right, the assets are kind of live forever on the blockchain. And so with several projects, we've actually seen the community take over the project. Obviously there's some work that has to be done in coordination with the developers to get access to the servers and get access to the website and all of that. But what's cool is that that process of taking over a project is actually a lot easier, since you still have the market for the original assets. You still have the ownership. You don't have to worry about whether the database is still around and kind of rehabilitate everything. You just have to rehabilitate parts of the project. And then of course, you have the investment of this community who's really excited about seeing the project move forward. And so it's been interesting to see that happen a couple times with projects. And then lastly, I'll say that I think there's still a lot of exploration to be done in the NFT space. It's still a really early space, and I think it's a great time to get involved and learn more about it, use all the projects, and if you're a developer, obviously it's a really ripe opportunity to build new projects that could turn into really big things as the space grows. And that's about it.
All righty. Hey, thank you very much for sharing that introduction with us. I'm going to speak in Spanish a little bit for a moment. Para los que no saben, ahorita nos está acompañando Devin Finzer. Devin Finzer es el cofundador y CEO de Opensea. Y bueno, ahorita nos acaba de hacer una presentación sobre Opensea. Y pues también aprovechamos parte del tiempo está abierto para preguntas. Entonces, si tienen algunas preguntas, las pueden postar en el chat. Y aunque esté en español, la podemos traducir al inglés. Okay, So yeah, Devin just finished giving us a summary of OpenSea, and just to make this a little bit of a different meetup, we had a few questions, and then just leave some minutes. Oh, so just open up for Q&A. So Devin, okay, so tell us a little bit more. All right, thank you for the presentation. Tell us a little bit more, just like how your journey, like how did you end up co-founding OpenSea? And yeah, I don't know if you just want to elaborate a little bit, like what led you to, blockchain and NFTs and like pursuing this idea and forming a team? Because I know you guys are originally based in New York, and actually I've been following like OpenSea. I've been using it since 2018, so I've been almost right there with you guys.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see, at the time in 2017, my co-founder and I were working in tech. I was at a company called Credit Karma in San Francisco, which does US credit scores for people. And at the time, like cryptocurrency was really like blowing up. A lot of people were talking about it in the tech world. And I think for me, there was sort of this curiosity that, not quite understanding why it was so interesting at first, I guess, because I'd followed Bitcoin peripherally and understood that that was a pretty interesting technology, but I'd never really gotten deep into sort of like the longer term implications of the technology. So when I think once you get to a certain threshold, as probably many of you have experienced, you just can't, you can't stop learning about it and stop getting deeper. And that was definitely sort of our story as well. And then I think in particular with regards to why we decided to build OpenSea as a product, I think we were always interested in the use cases for blockchain technology that weren't just purely financial, so weren't purely about trading or about currencies, but rather had like broader implications for regular folks who weren't necessarily like deeply involved in finance, right? And CryptoKitties was really, arguably the first product that resonated with, regular people. Like, my mom, for example, could buy a CryptoKitty and appreciate
Right.
it. And regular people can appreciate art, right? And so
Yeah.
this was a whole brand new space that was just completely new. That was a lot more, at least had a path to more general consumer accessibility. And having worked at like more consumer facing startups, that was just always like more exciting to me than, like really deep B2B or financial software or things like that. So yeah, then we kind of were interested in the space, and we were thinking about like, what are the things that would need to exist for the space to really take off. And the marketplace was kind of a really obvious and interesting entry point into the space. And so we just sort of started building it. We started kind of talking to a lot of the early users who were buying and selling things like CryptoKitties or some of the new projects, and just kept on building the features that people wanted to see in the marketplace.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. And
Sure.
the next question is just like, what's it like working and leading like a fast growing startup? Like, obviously, I think you guys are like about 10 or 8 employees, I think. How many employees are you guys?
We're still like 6 employees at the moment.
Okay, 6. So how has it been like just on like on the kind of more on the business side? I have technical questions later on, but just on the business
Sure.
side, how has that been like a challenge, or what have you learned as growing and leading like the startup? Because you're the CEO and you have 2 or 3 co-founders.
2 co-founders. Yeah.
Okay, so how has that been like leading, like learning your management style, just instilling your employees, and like it's absolutely wild that you guys have been able to have so much volume with 6 employees too. That's absolutely wild.
Yeah, well, I think, I guess on the last comment, like I think what's interesting about this particular space is you can, or what we've seen with a lot of projects is you can have a really big impact and still be a really small team. So I think Uniswap, for example, was really just like one guy for a really long time. And he built like this protocol that had such a integral role and connected to every single token that was out there, right? And so a single application can actually end up having this really big impact, with a small team behind it. And similarly with OpenSea, we're kind of taking advantage of all of the NFTs that are being built. And so despite, if you were building an art marketplace on your own without a blockchain, you'd have to go and like convince a bunch of artists to join your marketplace and like,
Right.
do all these things, versus what we get to do is we have all of these artists who are already out there building existing NFTs and bringing in the supply, and then just going to OpenSea to actually do this one thing, which is buying and selling. So I think that's one of the reasons that we've been able to remain relatively small. But as the market has grown, we are definitely going to be scaling up the team. So then in terms of doing a startup and running a startup, I think it's been a really great learning experience. It's essentially my first company. I did a company like a while back, but it was acquired really shortly into the life cycle of the company. So I've definitely learned like a lot of really interesting lessons, a lot of really important lessons that I think you can really only learn if you go and actually do it. You can't really learn it from going to business school or reading in a book as much as you would from going and doing it. And then I think also this particular space, there are certain lessons that apply to the crypto space that I think are kind of unique to the crypto space versus a more traditional startup, like a business to business SaaS startup. And I think some of those lessons include this idea that you're really building for a very early adopter community, and you're building for sort of an environment that feels a lot like the early internet, where there's still a lot of hurdles to actually get on the internet. There's a lot of friction associated with it, but at the end of the day, it's like this brand new technology that, as it takes off, has just enormous potential. And so I think you really have to manage your expectations around when things are going to happen. So for example, when we started OpenSea, we had a number of competitors that had raised a lot of money around the same idea, and were basically doing like kind of the same thing we were doing, but they sort of needed to have the timeline associated with a more traditional startup, where like you see the growth from like not day one, but like within a relatively reasonable period of time. And with a new technology, you're not always going to see the growth like really early on, but you have to, I think you have to be in it, for a bit of a longer time horizon, and sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel if you're going to build in the crypto space, because it's a lot harder to predict like when things will take off. So I think those were a couple of the interesting lessons.
Yeah, and just like you mentioned, because the technology is so new, has it been hard for you to like find, developers and just programmers who know what Solidity is, who know what smart contracts is? Has it been hard for you? Or have you had to develop those in-house, or how have you guys gone about that challenge?
Yeah, well, I think finding developers in general is really challenging. And for finding developers who know Solidity and know smart contracts, we've taken the approach that that is less important to us than just our solid fundamentals and the ability to write well-tested, robust code. And most of our the majority of, or I guess it's kind of split, but people on our team who come from more traditional backgrounds and have not done any Solidity or Web3 have been able to ramp up really quickly and understand it. And I think that would be different if we were building like a new blockchain, for example. In that sort of scenario, I think you need people who have like, who are trained in crypto specifically, and protocols and distributed systems. But for us, it's like, there are definitely finicky things about working in Solidity. There are definitely weird things about working in an environment where, you have to deal with block reorgs and, sort of waiting for transactions to go through and all those things. But for the most part, those are like things that solid developers who have experience building, writing code can figure out eventually.
Okay. All right, now to the more technical questions.
Sure.
So we have a few of them. So I'm just gonna. The first one is, what are some of the projects that you've seen have done like remarkable work in just building like a community around their NFT? So that's kind of, because it's not just releasing a product; it's like building that community, and like CryptoKitties, right? Like it was adorable, people loved it. but you are the co-founder of OpenSea, so you've seen like dozens of projects. Because I remember back in 2018, there were projects that were back then that are no longer on OpenSea, and so like just what are some of the projects that you've seen have done remarkable just job at building up the product and launching it? Like, why has that been? Why do you think that's been a success?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of really solid projects, and yeah, there definitely have been projects that have dropped off. To name a few, I think one community that we've always been really impressed with has been the Axie Infinity community. So they're really a project that launched shortly after CryptoKitties, kind of looked similar to CryptoKitties at the time. It was these like collectible, breedable things. So maybe at first we were a little bit skeptical that this was like going to be a project that stuck around, having seen a bunch of projects that were similar to CryptoKitties kind of fade away. But they've done a really good job of kind of fostering a really passionate community of people that hold these assets, paying a lot of attention to the community, introducing sort of this mishmash between NFTs and DeFi. So they have their own ERC20 token that's kind of part of their ecosystem as well. And that's one that we kind of hear a lot of people saying good things about it. I would say the other one, Crypto Voxels, which I mentioned, is one of my favorite NFT projects. And the story there was, it was a single developer who started in early 2018 and really just started, building a website, selling land that was tokenized as an ERC 721 asset, and starting a Discord community, getting people involved. And then over time, he really remained focused on building the best possible like foundation for a virtual world, and left everything else to kind of the ecosystem, right? He didn't try to rebuild, he didn't build his own marketplace, for example. He didn't build his own wallet. He didn't do all these things that we saw a lot of projects kind of get distracted by. Instead, he focused really on this one piece, which was this virtual world, and making it the best possible world that he could, and took advantage of all the improvements that kind of gradually came along. And so I think that theme of like not reinventing the wheel has been really important for a lot of projects. And then another project that has impressed us is Decentraland, which I guess has taken a slightly different approach in that they have built more things. So they have their own marketplace, and they have a little more of like the tooling around their world as well. But they've built a really interesting community. They've stuck around, and they're kind of paying attention to the community and growing. And then lastly, I would say one of our partners, Animoca Brands, is doing a ton of interesting things in bringing new IP into the space. So they launched a project called Formula One Delta Time.
Delta Time.
Game. Yeah, which is a game where, basically a racing game with the official F1 IP.
Did that sell for 100 Ethereum, or how much was it? 100?
There was one car that sold for over $100,000 at the time. Yeah. So they've done a lot of really cool stuff, bringing like more traditional gaming IP in. But really, honestly, I would say there's so many projects, and to mention all the ones that are solid and impressive is, would take a while, but there's just a lot of really cool stuff.
Okay. And then you mentioned in your presentation, that like your ERC-721s, basically you can't counterfeit them. Now, I was wondering if you could just explain to the audience, why can't you counterfeit an ERC-721? Like, how does that work? What's the mechanics behind that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, well, actually, I guess I would correct myself and say that you can counterfeit an ERC-721. You just won't get away with it, or you'll only get away with it for a very short period of time. So basically, the mechanics of that from a technical standpoint, so imagine I create a piece of digital art, I draw it on my computer, I upload it, and I've created this smart contract that represents this digital art, right? Or this unique piece of work that I've created, right? And now it has a smart contract address and it has a token ID. And on that smart contract address and the token ID, it points to the file of that image, right? It says, okay, this smart contract address, this token ID points to this file. Now, and so it's there, we've picked it up on our blockchain scanner. We know it's around. Other sites maybe picked it up and they've they're like, okay, we see this thing. And let's say someone else comes along and says, I want to sort of, I want to sell that thing, that same thing, without actually being the creator of it, or without actually being the artist behind it. So what they do is they take an image, they copy paste that image, they upload it, and they create a new token that's a new contract address and a new token ID, and it's the same, right? And OpenSea picks it up, and all these other marketplaces, they pick it up, and now there's two copies out there, the first one and the second one.
Right.
It's very analogous to, say there was a painting of the Mona Lisa, right? And you literally went and like got all the raw material and built, and got someone to paint the exact same thing, and now you have the second thing. Now the problem with that is that in the case of the Mona Lisa is in a very specific spot in the world, right? And it's in some museum somewhere, and it would be very difficult to actually go and like take the original Mona Lisa. And so anyone who like comes up with the second Mona Lisa, it's going to be really hard for them to convince people that that's the Mona Lisa, because people can go to the museum where the original is. Very similar in the blockchain world. You can come up with the second picture and the second contract address and the second token ID, but everyone can point to the original one and say, well, this is just a duplicate. This isn't the original. And the record is out there for everyone to see. And so a site like OpenSea, for example, if someone came along and saw that duplicate, or if we had some matching algorithms that said like, oh, we've actually seen this image before, then we probably wouldn't show it to people, because it's not something that we want people to buy. Maybe we'd market as like, this image has been seen before, or this image is a replica. Maybe some people do like to buy replicas of things, but it becomes completely transparent where was the original versus what is a copy, right? And so that's why the long answer, or the short answer was, you can do it, but you won't get away with it. And that's sort of like how that system works.
So it all depends on like who the issuer is. Like in this case, like for F1 Delta Time, F1, exactly. It was the one who had the contract to issue that Formula One. So like I could go and take a screenshot of it and deploy it, but it would be a totally different contract address, and obviously I'm not F1 Delta Time, so I could have a copy, but it would be just a replica, like you mentioned.
Exactly, yeah. And so what we've actually seen this happen many times, right? So Binance, we haven't seen it with Formula One Delta Time, but with Binance, we saw Binance launched an NFT, and people were trading around, and some enterprising individual came along and decided to do exactly what you described, and we noticed it, and we just blacklisted that contract. And then they can try again, but at the end of the day, they're going to be spending a lot of gas for very little profit, right? So that's exactly how it works.
Okay. Very cool. And then the next technical question I had before opening up to the rest of the audience, so I'm going to say this in Spanish. Entonces, ahorita le voy a hacer una pregunta más a Devin, y si ustedes en la audiencia tienen alguna pregunta técnica sobre los tokens NFTs o sobre los coleccionables, por favor, son más que bienvenidos a poner las preguntas en el chat y se las hacemos a Devin. All right. So the next question was like, how have you guys handled transitions and migrations from like projects such as ENS, or like who have upgraded their contracts, and now they've changed the whole, like you had to migrate your new ENS name to the new register, and like, because if not it was going to expire, and like how have you guys handled those project migrations and those contract upgrades? Like how has that been handled?
Yeah, it's a very like one-off, sometimes messy process. So the different things that we've had to deal with have been one, sort of migrating, just generally games migrating from one contract to another, right? So one of the biggest ones of this was Gods Unchained. Started out on one contract and then reminted every single card on the new contract, because there was some bug in the original. And it's just a pain, but we developed some tooling that makes it a little bit less painful. But overall, it's just it's a painful process. But we handle it by, swapping over the history or you're swapping over the addresses from the original one and like blacklisting the old contract. And, you can imagine that there's just a lot of like messing with our database to make sure that the old ones don't show up and the new ones do. With ENS, similar type of deal. When ENS migrated to a new contract, I seem to recall that we basically had to do a similar process that we did with Gods Unchained. There's also just scenarios where like NFTs don't, even with ENS, we still have some issues where like when an ENS name expires, we don't get an event that happened. And so it's really hard for us to like figure out that it's no longer owned by someone because it's expired, and it's not like it's not always the best user experience. So there's all of these kind of unsolved challenges with coordinating NFT movement across different sites. And the short answer is it's just kind of handled on a one-off basis.
Okay. And we have just like somebody making a question in the chat asking is there an example of NFTs applied to real estate? And yes, there's one called Realty, but I don't think Realty I don't think it's listed in OpenSea, is it?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Realty. The only one I know of, or I think maybe there's a couple, but there's one called Fabrica, which I believe was starting with tokenizing physical plots of land as opposed to real estate. So that was like the first market that they were going after. I'm not sure what the status of it is. And then obviously I think there's a bunch of projects that are sort of working with fractional shares of real estate. But it's certainly, it's like a space that a lot of people are looking at, especially now that NFTs are getting a little more visibility.
Okay. And then the second question is from Justin Cooper. It's a little bit along the same line, but it says, now that the cases for NFTs are expanding to include things like insurance contracts and deeds of ownership, do you plan on expanding OpenSea to include those different genres of NFTs or not?
Yeah, so we do support those or the genres that are included that are more sort of things like real estate or deeds. There's only a few of them at the moment. There was the Y Insurance NFT, and maybe, I think that's the only one that comes to mind. Probably like long term, we'll be sort of focused on certain verticals and not so much others. And I think there's like a variety of ways that you might want to trade NFTs, and some of those make sense for these more these other use cases, whereas some of them make sense more for like the collectible art game use case.
Right. Okay. And then, well, my last question on my side was, where do you see the NFT space heading? Like, how do you see it evolving?
Yeah, I think, well, there are a couple of interesting things that I think will happen, maybe early next year, that will certainly change, I think, some of the, or accelerate some of the trends that we're seeing today. So one, I think, is I think a lot of NFT applications will be enabled by higher throughput trading and more usable blockchains than Ethereum. So Ethereum has been amazing for DeFi and sort of like high value transactions and like really high value art. But it hasn't really worked super well for games where like, you're trading things around at the $1 or $2 mark often, and you want a much more like liquid market and a much more high throughput type of economy. So one thing that I'm really excited about is other chains that sort of widen the design space for what sorts of NFTs people can build. Right now, I think one of the reasons that the NFT space has kind of converged around digital art has been that it's been challenging to sort of support other use cases. But on the other hand, I do think that this sort of idea of digital art has really taken off in a big way. And it's, I think, more and more creators, more and more artists, more and more people who just want to sort of get their work out there in some capacity, or maybe even are just thinking about it and experimenting, or it's really resonating with people. So I think this idea of digitally owned art will continue to grow over the next year. But I do also think that some of the kind of use cases that people experimented with it really early on that just didn't kind of work in this high gas environment will also start to come to fruition sometime in the next year. And yeah, I think, you know, I don't really see any, or I'm not, I don't see a world where like people stop building NFTs. I think people will just continue building new stuff, and it'll, you know, it might not be like, it might not look like one hit game or one project that, you know, makes it into the stratosphere and leaves all the others behind. It might look more like a lot of different projects all kind of combining with each other in different ways that leads the whole space to grow. And I think that's kind of the theme that we've seen in DeFi and blockchain generally, is that it's not like, you know, there are these like leaders like Uniswap, for example, or MakerDAO, but on the other hand, there's a lot of, you know, it's not a sort of winner takes all market. It's a lot of different protocols kind of interoperating to create this really interesting ecosystem. And I think that's probably the same sort of trend we'll see in NFTs, where it's a lot of different projects that are all kind of collaborating to create something really interesting and new, versus like, you know, one Google or one Amazon
Right.
that dominates everything.
Wow, that's encouraging to hear. That's encouraging to hear.
Well, who knows? Yeah.
Well, Christian has a few questions, so I'm gonna, you know, yield the floor to him. And if anybody else has questions, please put them in the chat, and he would be more than happy to pass them along to Devin.
Yeah, so it's a quick question. So actually, how you guys actually manage to keep up with all the NFT that are going up like every day? For example, I know that you guys handle also ERC 1155, so there's like a whole bunch more of tokens. So how you keep it up on OpenSea with that?
Yeah. So one piece is that now the standards have converged a bit. So it's not like we're seeing like new standards every day or every week even. There's really just 721, 1155, and ERC 20. So keeping up with the new NFTs that are coming online has actually become easier and easier over time as the standard sort of becomes more robust. Additionally, as people are complying with the standard. So for example, when we first started, there were all these new NFTs, but no one was representing the images or the metadata in the same way. So people, you know, CryptoKitties had their own way of doing it. Axie had their own way of doing it. And now, partially because getting listed on a marketplace is sort of a prerequisite for a new NFT project, all of the new projects, for the most part, conform to that same metadata standard. And it's really easy to get a new project onto OpenSea. In fact, it doesn't require any effort on our part. That said, the pieces that have become challenging are, now that there's more supply, there is this problem of people creating fraudulent NFTs, people creating NFTs that shouldn't be surfaced on OpenSea because they're not things that people would want to see on a marketplace. So there's more moderation and community work that has gone into sort of the site and the discovery experience. So that's been challenging. But for the most part, I would say the technical side has gotten more and more robust as the standards have sort of solidified.
Cool. And you know, do you have any advice for people that want to start like creating their own NFT or art or whatever?
Is there like a gasless way of doing this?
Well, we might have some pretty interesting tools in that realm soon. Currently, yeah, it does require gas no matter where you go to mint your NFT, unfortunately. But I would say like a really good starting point is create, and especially since like these days, gas is, yeah, it's not nearly as bad as it was like a couple of weeks ago. I think like creating a storefront on if you're an artist or a creator or something like that, creating a storefront on OpenSea, having your own store and selling your own stuff is like a really good way to just get started and get your feet wet. Also just going and exploring and looking for all the digital art that's out there is, you know, it's a really good way. And, you know, for example, my family has created their own NFTs, and they're not, my sister isn't like artistic or anything like that, but she was able to sell one just because you know, there was someone out there who was kind of browsing and collecting. So I think, yeah, just going for it and, you know, investing a little bit of ether in it is a good way to start.
All right, so there's one more question from Ken from Memphis, Tennessee. And it says, you know, with the space so full of shiny objects, what are the hot areas to get started for a dev group that wants to get immersed in the NFT space?
I would say the hot areas to get started for dev group. It's a good question. I think learning from some of the lessons from the past couple of years of NFTs, and actually like trying some of them again, but in a new market, might be a really interesting place to start. So some of examples of that, like we saw a lot of really interesting projects with this sort of like mining mechanic, where you could go on a website and sort of like find these rare NFTs. There was a project called Clovers, and there's still a project called Avastar that have this kind of mechanic to it. And I think that's a really interesting mechanic that's just like, there's a lot to explore there, right? Recently with Meme, it's sort of a similar mining and farming mechanic. So I think sort of looking at the intersection of DeFi and NFTs and seeing what sorts of new mechanics you can build on top of them could be really interesting. Also, I think there's a lot of really interesting territory in the virtual world space. So building tools for people who are creating virtual worlds or areas to display their NFTs. And actually, that leads me to another area, which is a place to kind of show off your art, right? So I know there's a couple of projects that are working on like physical displays for art. I think that's a huge need. Also just ways to kind of like collect and curate, maybe even on a website where you can organize and bucket your NFTs. I've seen a couple of projects like that could be really interesting. And then also I think building new games. So there have been a few experiments with like interoperable gameplay where you can take an asset from one game into another, or like use assets from two games inside of your game. And I wouldn't say that like there's been one that has really like gone hard and tried to do it in a great way. There have been some that have been really good, but like, you know, also timing, I think, factors into this. And, you know, when you're really early doing that and there's only a certain audience, there's only so much traction you can get. But now that there is a really interesting audience for it, I think doing something where you're like combining NFTs from different places is really underexplored, in my opinion. There's not a lot of projects that are doing that in like a really good way. So actually, if I had to like vote for, there are a lot of different areas, but if I had to choose one, I would go for one that, you know, allows you to take like tons of different projects and kind of mishmash them together into something, you know, more interesting, right? Like something that allows you to combine your Axie Infinity asset with your CryptoKitty or something like that to create a new thing that you can then, you know, that's rare in some other way, right? So I think that's a pretty cool area to explore.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of one question that I came across, is that I think there's a project called Crypto Motors. And you know, what's preventing, like in that game, interoperability, you know, what's preventing, like for example, myself creating a car and making it like the fastest and most powerful car, you know, just upping it up. And then like, let's say there's a gaming, you know, like a race game. And how can I add that car? Like what's preventing like creators from just upping up all the characteristics of that car and just, you know, like the gameplay, like how do you control that gameplay from making, you know, the best sword or the best CryptoKitty, you know, like how do you limit that? Like if I create a racing game, you know, somebody can just create a car and make it with all the specifications, the fastest car, and then everybody can just do that. Then there's not going to be competition if anybody can just do that. So how does that gameplay rules kind of would work or work?
Well, you can do it in a variety of ways. One is that, and the way that most people have been doing it at the moment is that they have the NFTs on the blockchain, but then the logic of the game is like completely off chain, right? So if you look at like Animoca or Formula One, right? Like you have, in order to get a really powerful car, you either have to buy a really powerful car or you have to, you know, play the game such that your car increases in power. And there's no way that just like someone can come along and just create a really powerful one because the game doesn't let you do that, right? So
Yeah.
if you centralize more of the game, right, then you have just as much control over these things as normal digital assets, right? You don't have to. There's no like built for NFTs. You don't have to make it so that anyone can create one, right? You can just make it so that the game developers are allowed to create them, and you have to buy them, right? So I think that's probably the simple answer to your question. But I think at the same time, it is like one of the things that game developers do struggle with is how to balance their economies, right, and make them so that they're not pay to win, such that let's say there were some really expensive, powerful cars, you know, someone with a lot of money could just come along and buy them and then use them in the game. And the approach that I've seen most frequently with regards to this is actually decoupling the scarcity of the assets and the rarity and the, you know, look and feel of them from the power level, right? So, you know, maybe it's easy to obtain powerful cards inside of the game, or you have to play the game in order to obtain powerful cards. And then there's these sort of rare aesthetic pieces of the cards that are more where the people who would want to buy those cards would come into play, right? So you have like different, you make it so that there's still an opportunity for people to buy really expensive items, but those expensive items don't let them actually like take over or win the game.
Okay. Yeah, that was my final question on that. I don't know if does anybody else have any questions or comments. We have Devin. Let's see, somebody's looking at the chat here. Okay. Somebody mentioning something about augmented reality. That would definitely improve the NFT space. Okay. So somebody said NFT ownership of IP. Right. Just you can patent, you can have your patent on an NFT, I guess. You can transfer over that patent. Ah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to ask something, I mean, you mute yourself and talk.
Yeah. Se pueden quitar el mute y hacer preguntas si quieren.
All right, so I see that I think I mentioned the augmented reality use case. I think a lot of the friction that people have while understanding non-fungible tokens is the blockchain is not going to come and slap you in the hand if you steal a token. It's not a DRM per se, but once once the line between what is digital assets and what we consider a reality starts to blur out, and a clear example of this is augmented reality or even virtual reality. This is gonna suddenly make sense for a lot of industries, not just geeks and games and World of Warcraft players. So it wasn't a question, it's just a comment.
Awesome. We're glad to have that. Yeah.
So this question's easier to talk about than to read in the text, but you know, there are a lot of people who have day jobs, but are really curious to get involved, you know, in a dev project. Are there any marketplaces out there where there's that kind of concept where developers or architects can join a project and maybe get, you know, use tokenization to say your value add is this, and so your percentage is this? anyone tried that?
I think, well, some crypto projects are doing that with their token distributions, right? So like instead of, I mean, are you familiar with Y-Insure?
Yeah.
Sorry, or Wi-Fi?
Wi-Fi? Yeah.
Yeah, so with Wi-Fi, I mean, the distribution of the tokens was like completely just kind of to the original people who were involved in the project. There was sort of no initial distribution to any particular set of people. It was all just completely mined, and then what that resulted in was this sort of token distribution that was these very like core enthusiast or technical early adopters, and then a lot of people kind of continued building things on top of Y earn, and were incentivized to do so. So I think that was kind of the idea with some of these token distributions, but I don't know of any project that yeah, I guess that's a little more like developer centric.
It is, but so the reason I'm asking is because in Memphis, we're trying to build out the developer capabilities to bring more tech opportunities into our community. And you know, they're not a bunch of business people that learned how to program, right? So they're out there with some skills that would, you know, that would be value add, but trying to get them organized and give them an opportunity is something to jump in on a gig type economy versus go get a job at the, you know, the next group that's not hiring, right? So those resources are out there, and you know, how do we offer opportunities for them to get together and contribute?
Yeah, no, I think I think that's kind of like one of the great promises of crypto more generally is that, you know, you don't necessarily have to work for a large company. You can just be an individual, but you can still participate in the upside of developing open source software, right? So there's so many people out there, or I think the open source movement could be hugely accelerated by strong incentives to actually contribute, right? There's, you know, it's miraculous that all of the open source software that gets built currently is actually built by people who are just volunteers, and that's great. But I think if you allowed developers from, you know, Google, Facebook, or some of these larger tech companies to have, you know, their full-time job be writing open source software, you could imagine that the amount of software and the openness of that software would be massive relative to kind of today, where most open source software is you know, sponsored by bigger corporations and not as grassroots as it could be.
Right. It'd be nice if there was a marketplace for that, right? Where people could go and say, hey, I want to join this project and I've got these skills to offer, and they could work into the full-time gig, because they might have a part-time gig they hate, but they're a developer. We want their skills in the marketplace.
Yeah.
But we also, you know, there's also a big challenge with that, right? How do you validate the quality of their code and all that? Yeah. Same is true in the open source space, right? You're going to commit code. How good is your code?
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I think the community has settled down a little bit, and it seems like there's not many questions. Just one final one, I think. So we're going to be here wrapping up soon. Para todos, dentro de poco vamos a estar cerrando la Meetup dentro de poco. Entonces, si tienen últimos comentarios, por favor, poséenlos. Entonces, vamos a seguir. La siguiente pregunta. The next question. Devin, how's your Spanish, by the way?
Bien. Pero estoy tratando de aprender más y no podía hacer toda la presentación en español. Sería muy mal.
Okay.
Pero estoy tratando de practicar más.
That actually was pretty good.
Sí, está muy bien. It's very good, Devin.
Pero el vocabulario del blockchain es, creo que es difícil y hay muchas palabras que solo pueden decir en inglés también. Creo que sí.
Yeah, we use English for much blockchain related stuff. So
Yeah.
like NFT and everything, we use English.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
even if you use Spanish, you end up switching a lot to English terms.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the challenges actually. I just got approved. I'm waiting on an Ethereum Foundation grant to write more content in Spanish of blockchain. But that's the challenge, is that a lot of the words, you can't really translate them or use them in Spanish. So
Yeah.
yeah. So we have two questions. We're just going to use them in order. And it says, can I buy and own a unique NFT and then tokenize ownership of it as another token? So an NFT of an NFT square.
I see. Yeah. Um, yeah. So you can, or I think what this question might be asking is, can you take an NFT and then break it into pieces and sort of have different people own different pieces of it? And yeah, that is actually something that people have launched today. There's a project called Nifdex that allows you to break NFT into multiple pieces and allow many people to own it and trade it. Pretty cool project. I think it might be limited to certain types of NFTs at the moment, but I think that's kind of one of the cool things about this, is that once you have this asset tokenized in this capacity, you can do all sorts of stuff like that. There's sort of a different territory of this, but there's projects that allow you to lend NFTs or use them as collateral. So yeah, there's all sorts of things.
Okay. And the next one is in Spanglish. I'm going to do it in Spanglish. We'll just try it out here. This is a new language here. It says, ¿Qué ruta, what route recomendarías si quisiera convertirme en un crypto artist? So it's asking what would you recommend if I want to become a crypto artist? Algunas plataformas o flujo de trabajo para sugerir. Flujo de trabajo means workflow. So there you go. Flujo de trabajo, workflow. Are there any workflow, that you would recommend for an artist to get started and, become a crypto artist?
Sí, recomiendo que empiezas con, hay muchas plataformas que pueden usar para obtener NFTs y crear NFTs. Los recomiendo un artículo que nosotros I'll have to go back to English. So there's a blog post that we wrote called the NFT Bible that sort of talks about like the whole space, talks about a lot of the platforms. It's somewhat outdated now because it was written, I think, in late 2019, and a lot has changed since then. But that's a good starting place to kind of learn. In terms of platforms, now there's tons of platforms. You can try minting them directly on OpenSea, and you'll get your own smart contract to play around with, and like you have a little bit more control. There's obviously like sort of curated platforms like Super Rare. There's Rareable. There's Known Origin. There's Maker's Place, and all of them kind of have different trade-offs. Some of them are easier to create. Some of them are more exclusive, and the more exclusive ones, sometimes you can end up having a more excited audience. Yeah, it's the article right there. But I think, yeah, it's relatively simple these days. It's really just a matter of, for example, going to our storefront manager, creating the contract, and then minting the assets on it. And we're always available to help on Discord or Telegram if you have any trouble doing that. But yeah, and it also kind of depends on what type of art you're creating. So if you're creating like, if you're doing photography, obviously you probably have a flow where you're taking the images, uploading them, that type of thing. If you're doing digital art, then there's tons of different programs that you can use to create digital art, and so that all is relatively separate from the actual minting of the NFT.
Excellent. John McKay says you were doing good in Spanish.
Thank you.
Bueno, una pregunta más, Devin. ¿Todavía están basados en Nueva York o ahora están en California?
Mi mi, ¿cómo se dice? Co-founder,
Cofundador.
cofundador, él está en Nueva York ahora, pero estoy en California ahora, pero voy a regresar a Nueva York pronto. Y el, um, el lugar de la compañía es muchos lugares porque tenemos tenemos personas en Nueva York, una persona en California, otro persona en California, y también hay un contractor, ¿cómo se dice?
Christian, how do you say that?
Consultor.
Contractor, él vive en México. Entonces hay muchos lugares donde nosotros trabajamos y la compañía es how do you say distributed?
Distribuida.
Distribuida.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, even though I said it fast, yes, distribuida.
Yeah.
Okay, wow, excelente. Pero entonces sus cuarteles están en Nueva York, su head office, right?
Sí.
Okay. Bueno, ahorita se me vino a la mente una propuesta. Ya que hicimos un POAP, so we made a POAP para esta Meetup. Bueno, te quería proponer si es posible que la gente que tenga el POAP pueda ir a Nueva York y conocer el equipo o sus oficinas si están.
Sí, por supuesto.
Wow, perfecto. That's excellent.
Pero cuando el coronavirus no es un problema.
Sí, sí. Okay, excelente. Bueno, también estarás recibiendo un POAP de esta Meetup
Sí.
también. Y cuando quieras venir a Honduras, estás más que bienvenido o a Centroamérica, porque hay muchos proyectos de blockchain saliendo poquito a poquito, como por ejemplo, Cristian estuvo trabajando en un proyecto que se llama Afogato, donde hizo como, was it an NFT? An NFT of coffee bags.
We did two things. We did a ERC 1155 and sold the coffee bags like just like unisocks, and we also did like just a normal NFT. But we were experimenting with that at Denver and some hackathons testing out.
Nice.
So you could redeem the NFT for a real coffee bag. So
cool.
You know, yeah.
I think I remember that. Yeah, that was it was cool.
No clue.
If you get one of those tokens, I still got some coffee bags in here. So.
It's like email stuff.
Yeah, but it was interesting. I mean, some people actually buy us the coffee, and there were two bags that we couldn't deliver because of the coronavirus. But I mean, the people that bought, we were using Uniswap as a backend contract, and they didn't get the coffee, but they got the uni, so they were really happy.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I guess you know, that's been it's 8:21 p.m. So I think we better wrap it up here. Devin, muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo. Te lo agradecemos bastante desde Honduras. So we thank you very much from Honduras. Are you understanding me? I can switch to Spanish.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought so. Entonces, te agradecemos bastante en Honduras. Cuando quieras venir, estás más que bienvenido. Podemos probar comida local como baleadas. Y bueno, hay mucha comida, pero sí, también en El Salvador también hay proyectos de blockchain naciendo bastante. This is a little bit apart from Ethereum, but there's like a Bitcoin beach in El Salvador where you can buy with Bitcoin stuff in real life. And so, so there's a lot of projects going on, and we're trying to, you know, make Central America a growing blockchain and just general tech hub. So otra vez, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Thank you very much for joining us in this meetup. And yeah, man, we appreciate your time a ton. And if you're ever around here, you're more than welcome to come visit. And yeah, we look forward to just keeping in touch. And again, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Really, really great to be here, and really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks, Devin.
All right. Well, this video is going to be recorded and posted on YouTube Christian is going to post that. I don't know if you have any final words, Chris or Oscar.
Yeah, so I will